everyone, welcome to Build. I'm your host, Brittany Jones Cooper. We know that Amber Tamblyn from her movies like Sisterhood of the Traveling Pants, but the actress and director is now making waves with her unforgettable debut novel, Any Man. The book blends the genres of poetry and prose to tell the story of a serial female rapist who preys on men. It's a provocative and suspenseful novel that examines rape culture and the aftermath of sexual assault. Please put your hands together for Amber Tamblyn.
Thank you. You could keep going. It's all right.
Why not?
And that's our time. Thank you. I have such a great interview.
Take a bow. That was great. I'm sure when people hear that little description of the book, they're like, huh. So I want you to sort of take me into the description, how you describe the book when you talk about it.
Yeah, so the book centers around 6 survivors of sexual assault who are men. And they have all been attacked by a sort of amorphous female serial rapist who has been just sort of wreaking havoc across the United States. And in the interim, after their assaults, the book really takes a large look at media and social media and the press and sort of how we are complicit or complacent in the cultural part of rape culture.
Reading this book, it helps you see that bias even more. And I don't know why it is, but it seemed like in the book people were so much more up in arms because it was male rape, yet we deal with the reality every day in our culture. So what inspired you to sort of flip the tables and tackle it from that angle?
So the book, the seed idea of the book started because I wanted to create a female antagonist that was ugly on the inside and out, somebody who was truly vicious, who did not really have any maternal qualities, and who very much decided to harm people out of a sense of power, which is where most sexual assault takes place, and the reason behind it. It really doesn't have a lot to do with sex, it has to do with power dynamic. And I also wanted to look at what a female predator would look like if she had no consequences, much in the way that male predators have no consequences. Well, up until recently, until the Me Too movement, there's a lot of people who would just go and be very harmful towards people, and then nothing would ever happen to them. So I wanted to look at what that would look like if we took an archetype of a woman and said, no one can ever catch her in this book. They can't even identify her, yet she haunts everyone. And there are these very specific, upsetting descriptional pieces that we have that sort of paint a larger picture of what she is, to a point where society can't even tell if she's like part animal anymore. She really is quite an apparition in this book. And in that way, I wanted to sort of look at how apparitions affect sexual assault survivors in real life. Even far after somebody has been assaulted, the memory of the person that harmed them is still there for a very, very long time, if forever. So I wanted to look at those sort of 2 components together, and I think that the ultimate aim of making this about men was to try and find a way to resensitize us as a culture and the conversation around sexual assault. How do we do that? How do we have a new dialogue about it that feels truly inclusive to all genders, and saying, sexual assault knows no race, it knows no class, and it knows no gender. And in order for us to start talking about these endemic problems that we have, I think it's really important to look through a very large lens.
And you saying the word resensitize really hits me, because there's a scene where it's kind of like one of those talk news shows, and it's actually 4 women talking about this man.
You're the first person to bring that up.
Really?
Yeah.
And it's these 4 women talking about a male experience about rape, and it seems kind of insensitive, and they're kind of joking about it. Yet again, that's something that happens on a regular basis, and we have groups of men making decisions for women, and we see that all the time. So in analyzing how the media, I'm just trying to frame that in a different way. It's like, how big of a part was the media of this for you? Like, why was it important to add?
Yeah, it was a very big part of it for me. And this particular segment that you're talking about is modeled after sort of a Nancy Grace type segment, where people are talking very graphically about several of the victims who were assaulted by this woman known only as Maude, and and they are very being sort of cavalier about in talking about the experiences of these men and making some jokes, but also sort of saying, how could it possibly be rape? Like, how does a guy actually get raped? I think very much in the way that the female experience is constantly like, well, they were, fooling around beforehand, so how can it not be rape? Or she was wearing this, so how did she not ask for it? Those same sort of unforgivable, unacceptable double standards that women are held to. I wanted to look at the other side of that and say, and have the reader look at it and go, well, this does sound ridiculous. And it's like, yeah, it does, but now apply it to us and see how that feels. I think what's so important for me about this book, and I really hope that a lot of men read it, it's difficult, but it's important, and I think it will be very refreshing. I think you'll also just enjoy it from the standpoint of a basic thriller. It's a ballsy-ass thriller. I'm really proud of that. It is, but I think at the same time you'll look at it and everything that every woman has ever told you, that's tried to explain to you what this experience is like. And I'm not just talking about the gruesome violence that happens. I'm talking about the post-violences, things that happen after the fact, that happen after assault, the way in which people are not believed, the way in which their stories are taken away from them, the way in which they're silenced, they're threatened, their livelihood is threatened, their families are threatened, their bank accounts are threatened through lawsuits and intimidation. So I think look at these large lenses, and I just really hope that it makes men and some women too not just see it for what it is, but feel it for what it is.
And you talk about the aftermath, and I thought that was really cool too, is that there's 6 different men who are violated in the book, and they each have a very different reaction, and they each deal with it very differently. And I think that was really important to show that there's not one way to deal with sexual assault, but also it was some of them, they were very male ways of dealing with sexual assault, which I thought was really fun to explore, and how men would kind of carry it with them differently.
Yeah, it was very important for me to make sure that the 6 men were extremely diverse in many different regards, from their socioeconomical background, to their gender, to their race, to their upbringing, to their job description, to their own self-worth, how they feel about themselves. You have one who's sort of a fractured, failed stand-up comedian who lives in New England, and his way of coping with his brutal attack is to make jokes about it that are inappropriate, but that's how he gets through the day. And then you've got an extremely sensitive father of 2 who was a former poet and now, is an English teacher, and so you have very different lenses of types of people in this book. And also the ways in which they were assaulted very much mirror, the other side of the coin, and what I think predominantly women experience, from just straight up being drugged and raped, all the way over to coercion, all the way over to you're not 100% sure you were raped, because we don't know where the boundary is. We don't know where the actual definition is. I mean, we know, but they don't know. So it was really looking at the different lenses of how those things happen, and making sure that all points were touched. There's also even a character in it who's extremely unlikable. He's unlikable to me anyway. He's an alt-right, provocateur, and it happens to him. And his story is told in a way that sort of, implicates the reader in saying, do you think he deserves this? Because he's awful. He's an awful person. But do you think he deserves it? What's happening to him? And so I tried to just really look at it as broadly as I could, in order to say anyone possible who's reading this book will be affected and will be asking themselves some very difficult questions at the end of it.
And you didn't write the book as a straight novel, which is one of the first things that first caught me off guard, and then was really entertaining and fun, because you kind of don't know how each chapter is going to be laid out, and some of it's poetry, and some of it, one chapter is just straight up tweets, which I thought was a really unique way to add the commentary of how we talk about rape and how we deal with trauma with social media. It was really fascinating. You sort of, and I don't want to give too much away, but you use people that we know in social media, and they're giving their take on it. And it felt very real and relatable, but also you see how damaging it can be to the victims and the people going through it.
I think when it's on the page like that, so much when we're going through social media, we're like scrolling through and we see a hashtag that someone's created that's, created a movement that feels like something we want to be a part of. But we're scrolling through it constantly. And then we put our phone down and we go off and we do whatever. But when it's on the page like this, it's really permanent. And there's something about that I think it forces the reader to address our own complacency to a certain level, myself included. I totally add myself into this. You know, and I think even looking at those people that we love who are, whether it's liberal, conservative, no matter what the background is, that in some way we should look at and make sure that in the effort to help, that we are not also hurting. And I think that happens more often than not. And I think that social media can create a world that's that helps bullying to thrive in a certain way. And so that section is specifically meant to sort of go from this interior lens where you are in the heads, you're in the first person minds and experiences of these men, and seeing like how it affects their children, how it affects their wives, their mother, they're like the people in their direct world. And then you immediately smash out of that and go to the outside world. You go to the Nancy Graces. You go to, the 24-hour news cycle, the 24-hour social media news cycle, and you see suddenly you kind of, it gives you this sense, at least for me as a writer, it helped to show how polarizingly painful those two realities can be and how disconnected they are at the same time.
How did you do research for this book? Because you mentioned like the Nancy Grace. Like, did you just watch hours of that show? Because the chapter you wrote in that voice felt really authentic.
Yeah, I think, well, I didn't do a whole lot of research. I watched a couple things of hers, but anyone here could literally probably write a chapter being like, this is what I think Nancy Grace sounds like. So that part wasn't hard. I think for me, going down the rabbit hole and looking at statistics through RAINN and some other really wonderful organizations, just basically about how many men actually are sexually assaulted by women, and looking at how many are reported, and you realize that it's like less than 1 in 10 actually report it, and that there's very little scientific evidence that we have about it. There's just not a whole lot. It really is not a conversation that has been part of the larger issue at hand, which is why I think, that this is something that we should also be talking about, and we should be bringing this into the fold of what the larger context is.
Like you said, I think people like to make jokes maybe sometimes, and it doesn't happen to men, but it certainly does. And I did a little research as well, and just the rates of suicide and all of those things for rape victims also applies to men.
Yeah,
so it's a very real issue.
Most especially in the most marginalized groups, such as the trans community.
Exactly. And, poetry is something that's really close and dear to your heart. You've written books of poetry, and that is also in the book kind of sprinkled throughout. So why was that important for you to put in that voice as well?
I have dyslexia, and I get very bored with fiction. I have a hard time absorbing it. So for me, as a writer, poetry, I always gravitated towards poetry because it felt like poetry to me feels like a single powerful bullet, as opposed to like, a series of weapons. It just feels singular and potent and quickly absorbable, in the way that fiction takes much longer to pack a punch. And so for me, the writing of this book was slight experimentation, but also saying, I have the freedom to express the feelings that these men are going through in whatever way I want to. That's part of the limitlessness of the imagination and the ability to write something. And certainly in contemporary fiction, I think there's a lot of writers who are taking some different types of risks. And even though I don't read a whole lot of fiction, what I have read, what I've enjoyed, has said, do what you do strongest and really lean into that and tell the story in the way you best know how. And, fiction has a wide definition, and many different forms of that are possible in order to convey an emotion.
The timing of this feels kind of perfect, obviously, with what we're going.
Is it?
Yeah, I know. Why? Obviously, with Me Too and Time's Up, you're very involved in Time's Up. How long have you been working on this book? Because the timing just feels really perfect.
Yeah, I have been working on this book for almost 4 years.
So well before all of this sort of
Yeah,
started
in fact,
blowing
I think
up.
I'd finished my final draft before sending it to my editor for the first time. Not my final draft, my first draft, like shortly before the Me Too movement just broke wide open. So, you know, I don't think that it was luck. I think that all of these feelings, and certainly ideas surrounding female rage and the boxes we are sort of confined to, and wanting to be able to be powerful and ugly at the same time, is in the zeitgeist. I don't think that this was anything, you know, while it's a very different type of a story, I do think that it is out there, and that there are a lot of writers writing about it in different capacities right now.
You mentioned rage, and I feel like I'm mad too. Everybody is so mad. Was it difficult to write maybe towards the end of this book, because you're kind of writing it and you're living it, and is that ever frustrating? Did this keep you up at night? Like, how much did it stay with you?
It stayed with me a lot. I was also pregnant while I wrote this book, for a majority of it, pregnant, and then had a newborn toddler. You know, within the first year of her life, were really the years in which I was writing it. So it was interesting. It was palpable and very powerful for me. But I think it also just allowed me to go to some of the more like vigilante spaces in my imagination, and to really go deeply into just excavating and looking for the things that were the most upsetting, and to think of those in metaphorical terms. So to also just think, like, what about womanhood is so upsetting to the world and so disgusting to the world, and to take those archetypes and to say, all of the many things that we are described as, I am now actually going to take them and combine the single most atrocious woman you've ever seen in literature. Okay, that might be a total exaggeration, but that's how I
she's
feel.
Pretty. I mean,
She's pretty
you did a good
foul.
job.
And, you know, like, I'll just tell you this one piece of it, which is the only piece of serological evidence that they find, is a 6-foot-long white hair. That's it. That's all they find. So that'll, like, tell you what kind of creature. There's other factors that come into play and sort of descriptions, but, you know, I really wanted to create folklore around this woman.
You did. She's really, really scary. Like, you did a really great job at that. Back to Time's Up a little bit. I know recently, and obviously we've all been following the story, and one of the big things when stuff sort of started boiling over is like, what is the action going to be? What are we going to see change? So recently SAG-AFTRA did try to make some changes when it came to where people are holding meetings, and they limited to where those meetings should be held. Do you think that's a good step? You know, what else would you like to see sort of in the near future? Or what do you think changes could be made in the near future?
Are you talking just specifically, like, overall to the entertainment business?
Yeah, I
or
think
to
overall to
guilds?
the entertainment business, since that's sort of been the jumping off point for a lot of it.
Well, you know, I think that inclusion is the message of the century, and that includes sort of the conversations I'm having with this book. And certainly in the entertainment business, it is, it goes without saying that, you know, it is so slanted towards the voices of white men, from not only, you know, the work that's made, but also the reviewers that review the work, so that things can't even succeed that are not outside of the male gaze. That's a real problem. But the fact that people are calling it out and speaking so openly to it now, and the fact that, you know, like, the Academy just brought in like a record number of women and women of color and people of color into the Academy to vote, and I think that that's a huge step, doing things like that and saying, okay, the people who are going to be voting for awards going forward, it's going to look like the world we live in. It's not just going to look like, you know, the world of the past.
I was actually just having that conversation with a friend about some study came out about the number of reviewers that are white men. Mm-hmm. And I was like, that is so funny, because I never read reviews.
It's something like 81%.
Yeah, it's an alarmingly high number. And when you look at Rotten Tomatoes, I mean, that really does influence.
Well, it goes even further than that. It's even more disturbing than that, because then even places like Rotten Tomatoes and certain other aggregate sites give these things that are like gold tomatoes. I don't know if that's what it's called on there, but certain reviewers, though, get this sort of gold platinum status, and they're allowed into festivals, and they don't have to pay for the festival passes, which are hundreds of dollars. So now you're leaving out, like, young women from independent sites, from other places that reviews, and it becomes truly like this disgusting boys club, so that you're not even allowed into it to review a movie. It's not like anybody can go into a theater and review it. You have to be invited by the studios, and it becomes this sort of cyclical, sick reciprocity within the community of reviewers, and that is so sad, because the reviews, even in the New York Times, what they say goes, succeeds.
I will say, though, I was saying in this conversation, as a Black woman, I constantly am reading blogs and different sites that are more geared towards me because I do trust their opinions more than the reviews. So I think that's already happening. But yes, it would be great if within the industry there was more access.
I think part of that is that, again, going back to the inclusion, is that it's not enough for us to make our own spaces, which we've been doing our entire lives since the Roman Empire. We have to tell these people, you have to include us. We're not asking you. This is not a choice, and we will do it by any means possible. I love what Janelle Monáe said. She said, we come in peace, but we do mean business. And I really, really emphatically agree with her on that.
I agree. I could talk to you forever about this specific topic, but I think it's a good time to open up to the audience for a couple of questions. So who do we have first? Oh, right there.
Hi. I just want to say congratulations on the book. Looks
Thank you.
amazing. I can't wait to read it. It seems like symbolism is a really hefty theme in the book, and even down to the title, Any Man. I was wondering if that was kind of a play on Everyman, the play, the allegory.
Oh, no one has asked me that. It's not. There's this term very specifically reveals itself in the book for a very specific reason. And it sort of, I think, ties together the whole theme and the symbolism behind the message.
Good question.
Yeah.
I've been watching your career since you were a teenager.
Get out of town.
You're a wonderful actress and a dynamic woman. I was wondering, and I'm sure from what you've discussed, that I find people that have been violated this way have a hard time coming forward. They think, well, I've got to do it because other people could get hurt. But they also don't want to be victimized again. As you say, in the press, online, it's like they'll always be a victim then when they come forward.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, this book touches a lot on that. When I talk about the violences that happen after the initial violence, that's what I mean. I'm talking about how, we as a society think we're helping. One of the best examples I can think of is Rose McGowan, who's a friend and an acquaintance. Her experience after that Weinstein story came out was that every single article, every single one, even the ones that interviewed her and were trying to lift her up and be allies in those early days, the picture that they would attach to the articles they wrote were pictures like 2 decades old of her at Sundance with Harvey Weinstein on the red carpet. So now this is what this woman has to look at every single day in her feed when she's tagged in those things. There's a form of latent torture in what the media does. And we have to call it for what it is, and we have to create spaces for those of us who do feel comfortable coming forward to tell stories, to tell them and be held up and protected by the rest of the community. That means all of you on social media. You don't give into that bullshit, frankly, about we've gone too far. Like, we don't say that about global warming. Why are we saying that about people's bodies? And that everyone else who's not comfortable doing that does not have to come forward. They don't have to do it at all. They can protect themselves. That's the most important thing we can do, is for everyone to meet the world at their own place and their own pace. And so for me, the book looks at all of those things together at once. So it looks at how people are re-victimized and sort of re-traumatized by the experiences, often, sometimes even just by coming out, and how you have been this sort of piece of meat to a predator, and then the media goes around and turns you into another piece of meat in a certain way. So I hope that this, sort of indicts a lot of our culture and helps all of us to look at maybe the ways we are a part of that.
And there is an empowering part of it with how one specific character kind of deals with his trauma as well. So I kind of liked having that angle too of like turning into activism and things like that. Absolutely. Well, Amber, it was really, really great chatting with you guys. With you. The book is available today.
Woohoo!
It's called Any Man, available where any books are sold. Give it up for Amber.
Thank you. Thanks, you guys.